She was cast out the moment her condition could no longer be hidden, when whispers hardened into judgments and judgment turned into exile. In the small community where she lived, pregnancy outside the rigid rules of marriage was treated not as a human reality but as a moral failure, a stain that had to be removed for the sake of appearances. Neighbors who once greeted her with easy smiles now avoided her eyes, their silence heavier than open insults. Elders spoke in hushed but authoritative tones, declaring that her presence brought shame, that she was a bad example for younger girls, that consequences were necessary to preserve order. No one asked how the pregnancy happened, whether it was born of love, coercion, or simple human vulnerability. The details did not matter. What mattered was that she had broken an unspoken code, and for that, she had to go. Her family, already struggling to survive, felt the weight of communal pressure pressing down on them. Fear of being ostracized themselves pushed them into cruel decisions disguised as necessity. Words like, "for your own good," and "we have no choice," were spoken as they turned her away, ignoring the tremor in her hands and the quiet panic in her eyes. She was told she would bring ruin to the household, that no one would trade with them, no one would speak to them, no one would respect them if she stayed. In that moment, love became conditional, and survival took precedence over compassion. She left with little more than the clothes she wore, carrying not only the physical weight of pregnancy but the crushing knowledge that she had been deemed disposable. As she wandered away, the rejection followed her like a shadow. Every step reinforced the message that her body, now visibly changed, had become a symbol of disgrace. The world felt suddenly hostile, structured in ways that left no room for mercy. Hunger, fear, and uncertainty settled into her thoughts, but what hurt most was the internalization of blame. She replayed every memory, searching for the exact moment where she might have chosen differently, wondering if she truly deserved the punishment she had been given. Shame crept in quietly, whispering that perhaps they were right, that her suffering was the natural result of her actions. Yet beneath that imposed shame was a fragile resilience, born not from hope but from necessity. Each rejection stripped away illusions about fairness, revealing a harsh truth about how easily society turns on those who fail to conform. Her exile was not an isolated act of cruelty but part of a larger pattern where vulnerability is met with condemnation instead of care. She walked on, carrying the silence of those who refused to stand beside her, the echo of doors closing behind her, and the unspoken understanding that her journey forward would be shaped by the judgment that had already defined her in the eyes of others. She walked without direction at first, driven less by choice than by the simple need to keep moving, because standing still made the weight of what had happened press too hard against her chest. The road stretched thin and dusty, bordered by dry grass and scrub that scratched at her legs as she passed. Each step away from the village felt unreal, as though she were moving through a dream shaped by fear and exhaustion. The sun hung high, unkind and relentless, and she learned quickly to pace herself, to breathe through the ache in her back and the slow, constant pull in her abdomen. She drank sparingly from the small container she carried, knowing she had no idea how long it would be before she found water again. Her feet grew sore, then numb, then sore again, but stopping felt dangerous, like an invitation for despair to catch up with her. As the day wore on, the landscape changed in subtle ways. The path narrowed, becoming less traveled, marked only by faint tracks and broken twigs. Signs of people thinned until there were none at all, and the silence became almost oppressive. Birds watched from a distance, their calls sharp against the stillness, and insects hummed in the heat. She began to notice abandoned things along the way, a rusted bucket half buried in dirt, the collapsed frame of a small hut overtaken by weeds, reminders that others had once passed through this land and moved on or disappeared. Each discovery stirred a quiet unease, but also a strange comfort in knowing she was not the first to be left behind by life. By late afternoon, fatigue settled deep into her bones. She found a fallen tree and rested for a while, rubbing her swollen feet and talking softly to the child inside her. Not because she expected a response, but because the sound of her own voice reminded her she still existed. When she stood again, her body protested, but she forced herself onward, guided by nothing more than instinct and the faint hope that somewhere ahead there would be shelter. The air began to shift as the sun dipped lower, carrying with it a cooler breeze and the promise of night. Shadows stretched long across the ground, distorting familiar shapes into something unfamiliar and vaguely threatening. It was then that she noticed the gates. At first, they appeared as little more than dark lines against the fading light, half hidden by overgrown vines and leaning posts. As she drew closer, their shape became clearer, tall iron bars twisted with rust, standing open as if forgotten by time. Beyond them lay a wide, cracked path leading toward a structure that rose out of the gloom like a relic from another era. The mansion loomed in the distance, its once grand facade now scarred and crumbling, windows dark and empty, walls stained by years of neglect. She stopped just outside the gates, heart pounding, torn between the instinct to flee and the undeniable pull of shelter. The mansion radiated abandonment. Weeds choked the pathway and stones lay scattered where steps had collapsed. The silence here felt different, heavier, as though the air itself held its breath. She hesitated, listening for any sign of life, any movement that might signal danger. There was nothing, only the whisper of wind through broken branches and the creak of metal as the gate shifted slightly. Hunger and exhaustion finally outweighed fear, and she stepped through, the sound of her footfall echoing faintly in the open space. As she walked closer, details emerged from the shadows. The columns at the entrance were chipped and cracked, once ornate carvings now softened by erosion. A door hung ajar, its wood swollen and splintered, revealing a darkness beyond that swallowed the remaining light. She paused again, placing a hand against her belly, grounding herself before crossing the threshold. Entering felt like stepping into another world, one suspended between past and present, untouched by the judgment she had fled, yet filled with unknown risks. Inside, the air was cooler and carried the scent of dust and decay. Her footsteps echoed softly against the stone floor, the sound magnified by the emptiness. Faded furniture lay scattered, draped in torn fabric, and cobwebs stretched like fragile curtains across doorways. She moved slowly, carefully, aware of every sound her body made, flinching at the creak of a loose board or the flutter of something unseen retreating into the shadows. Light filtered in through cracked windows, illuminating patches of the floor and revealing patterns left by time and neglect. She explored cautiously, guided by the practical need to find a place to rest. In one room, a collapsed ceiling blocked the way. In another, rainwater had pooled, leaving the floor slick and treacherous. Eventually, she found a corner where the roof still held, where the ground was dry and relatively clean. She sank down with a sigh that trembled out of her, leaning against the wall and letting exhaustion wash over her. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe she was safe, that this forgotten place might offer temporary refuge from a world that had rejected her. As darkness deepened outside, the mansion transformed. Shadows grew longer and unfamiliar noises echoed through the halls, the building settling, animals moving within its walls. Fear stirred again, but she reminded herself that she had faced worse than strange sounds in an empty house. She gathered scraps of fabric and debris to make a small nest, curling her body protectively around her stomach. Sleep came fitfully, broken by dreams of doors closing and voices calling her name, but it came nonetheless, pulled from her by sheer exhaustion. In the days that followed, the mansion became both shelter and challenge. She learned which rooms flooded when it rained, which corridors were safest to pass through, where the light was strongest in the morning. She ventured outside to forage, finding fruit trees gone wild and a small stream not far from the grounds. Each return to the mansion felt like crossing an invisible boundary, stepping back into a liminal space where time moved differently. Her isolation deepened, but so did her sense of self-reliance. The mansion did not judge her. It did not whisper or turn away. It simply existed, broken and silent, offering what little protection it could. As her body changed and the child inside her grew stronger, her connection to the place shifted. What had first felt like a desperate hiding place slowly became something closer to a temporary home. She cleaned small areas, clearing debris, creating order where there had been only decay. These small acts gave her a sense of control, a reminder that she could still shape her surroundings, even if she could not change what had already happened. The mansion, in its ruin, mirrored her own state, marked by hardship yet still standing. She often wondered about the people who had once lived there, imagining laughter echoing through halls now silent, grand gatherings replaced by dust and echoes. Those thoughts made her feel less alone, as though the walls themselves understood loss and abandonment. Nights remained difficult, filled with uncertainty and the ever-present fear of being discovered or harmed, but each morning she woke still alive, still capable of moving forward. Her journey into the mansion was no longer just a physical act of seeking shelter, but a crossing into a space where survival demanded patience, adaptability, and a quiet courage she had never known she possessed. She sensed him before she truly saw him, a presence that altered the air in the mansion in a way she could not explain. It began as a feeling of being watched, not in the sharp, predatory way that made the skin prickle, but in a quieter, heavier manner, as though someone else was breathing the same silence. She paused in the corridor, her hand resting instinctively on her stomach, listening past the familiar creaks and distant animal sounds she had grown used to. There was a difference this time, a subtle rhythm that did not belong to the building itself. Her heart began to race, torn between fear and curiosity, and she considered retreating to the corner she had claimed as her own. When she moved again, her steps were slow and deliberate, each one measured to avoid noise. Light spilled weakly from a tall window at the end of the hall, and within that pale glow stood a figure, still and upright, as if carved from shadow. He did not move at first, and for a moment she wondered if exhaustion had finally begun to distort her senses. But then he shifted slightly, enough to confirm that he was real, solid, and watching her just as carefully as she watched him. He wore dark, well-fitted clothing that looked strangely out of place amid the dust and decay, and his posture carried a restrained confidence that contrasted sharply with the ruin around them. Neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, thick with unasked questions and unspoken fears. She noticed how he kept his distance, standing far enough away to avoid appearing threatening, his hands relaxed at his sides. His face was difficult to read in the dim light, but there was something restrained in his expression, a guardedness that mirrored her own. She realized then that he looked as startled by her presence as she was by his, as though the mansion had been his refuge long before it became hers, and neither of them had expected to share it. Her voice, when she finally found it, came out low and cautious. She explained who she was in the simplest terms, offering only what felt necessary, her words shaped by years of learning when to speak and when to hold back. She did not ask who he was right away. Part of her feared the answer, feared that naming him would give him power over her fragile sense of safety. He listened without interrupting, his attention focused fully on her, and when she finished, he nodded once, as if acknowledging a truth he had already guessed. When he spoke, his voice was calm, controlled, carrying a refinement that hinted at a life far removed from hers. He told her that the mansion belonged to him, that it had for many years, though he rarely used the word belonged, as if ownership itself were an uncomfortable concept. He did not mention wealth at first, but there was no mistaking it in the way he carried himself, in the ease with which he occupied space, in the subtle assurance that suggested he had never had to fight for survival in the same way she had. Yet beneath that assurance was a loneliness so profound it seemed to have hollowed him out. He explained that he came here to be alone, to escape a world that demanded too much and offered too little in return. The mansion, forgotten and decaying, allowed him to disappear without truly vanishing. It was a place where expectations could not reach him, where silence felt like relief rather than punishment. As he spoke, she understood that his isolation was chosen, while hers had been forced upon her, and the contrast lingered uncomfortably between them. Still, there was a shared understanding in their mutual retreat from society, a recognition that neither of them fit neatly into the world beyond the gates. Their early interactions were cautious, defined by boundaries they both respected. He offered her food without insisting, left blankets where she could find them without having to ask, ensured there was always distance enough for her to feel safe. She accepted his help warily, pride and necessity warring within her, but the steady ache of hunger and the demands of her changing body left her little room to refuse. In return, she offered him conversation when he seemed willing, small pieces of her story shared in fragments rather than confessions. Trust grew slowly, built not on grand gestures but on consistency. She began to notice the contradictions in him. Despite his wealth, which became increasingly evident through subtle details and offhand remarks, he lived with a stark simplicity that bordered on austerity. He spoke of boardrooms and international travel with the same detachment he spoke of the mansion, as though none of it truly belonged to him. When she asked why he chose to live in a place like this when he could have anything, he hesitated, searching for words that might make sense of feelings he had long avoided examining. He spoke of loss, not in specifics, but in the abstract, of relationships that had withered under the weight of expectations, of being valued more for what he owned than for who he was. As days turned into weeks, their shared space became a delicate balance of coexistence. They developed routines that rarely overlapped unless intentionally chosen, giving each other room to breathe. Yet there were moments when their paths crossed naturally, in the early morning light or the quiet hours before night fully settled. And in those moments, something shifted. Conversation flowed more easily. Laughter appeared unexpectedly, soft and surprised, as though neither of them had realized how much they missed the sound. She found herself looking forward to these interactions, not because they promised security or solutions, but because they reminded her she was still capable of connection. He, in turn, seemed changed by her presence. The mansion felt less like a tomb and more like a living space, shaped by shared meals and quiet exchanges. He asked about her hopes with a gentleness that did not demand answers, listened when she spoke of fear without trying to fix it. For the first time in years, he felt seen not as a symbol of success or failure, but as a man stripped down to his essentials. Her resilience, forged through hardship he could scarcely imagine, challenged his own assumptions about strength and vulnerability. The imbalance between them was never fully absent. She was aware always of the power his wealth represented, of the ease with which he could alter her circumstances if he chose. That awareness made her cautious, determined to maintain her independence even as she accepted his help. He seemed to sense this and went out of his way to ensure that nothing he offered came with conditions. Their connection existed in a fragile space between gratitude and equality, shaped by mutual respect rather than obligation. At night, when the mansion settled into its familiar chorus of creaks and whispers, she sometimes lay awake thinking about him, about the strange twist of fate that had brought them together. She wondered how two people from such different worlds could find common ground in a place defined by abandonment. He too found his thoughts returning to her, to the quiet strength she carried, to the way her presence disrupted the careful isolation he had built around himself. The mansion, once a symbol of escape, had become the setting for an unexpected encounter that neither of them had sought but both were slowly beginning to need. His wealth was never announced, never displayed in the way people usually expected it to be. It existed quietly, woven into the smallest details that only revealed themselves over time. The quality of the materials he used, even in a place as decayed as the mansion, the precision of his movements, the way he spoke about distant cities and industries without curiosity or pride, all hinted at a life shaped by abundance. To her, it felt almost unreal that someone who could command so much in the outside world chose to live among broken walls and dust. The contrast unsettled her because wealth, in her experience, was always loud, always visible, something that separated people sharply into those who had and those who endured. With him, it was muted, like a burden he carried rather than a privilege he enjoyed. As she learned more, she realized his isolation was not an accident or a temporary retreat. It was a carefully constructed distance built layer by layer over years of disappointment. People had always approached him with expectations, assumptions formed before a single word was exchanged. To them, he was an opportunity, a solution, a resource to be tapped, rarely a person to be understood. Relationships came with invisible contracts, unspoken demands for access, influence, or validation. Over time, those patterns eroded his trust, teaching him that solitude was safer than connection, that being alone was preferable to being used. The mansion became the physical manifestation of that belief, a place where his wealth could not define him because there was no one there to interpret it. Yet isolation, even when chosen, carried its own cost. He filled his days with routines that required little emotional engagement, managing investments from afar, making decisions that affected countless lives without ever seeing their faces. Efficiency replaced meaning and success became abstract, measured in numbers rather than fulfillment. Nights were the hardest, when silence stretched too wide, and there was no distraction left to keep unwanted thoughts at bay. In those moments, the mansion felt less like a sanctuary and more like a mirror, reflecting back the emptiness he refused to acknowledge. He told himself this was the price of freedom, that independence required sacrifice. But the justification grew thinner with each passing year. Her presence disrupted that fragile equilibrium. She saw his wealth not as something to chase or fear, but as an incidental fact, no more defining than the scars in the walls around them. This unsettled him more than admiration or envy ever could. She asked practical questions, focused on survival, on the immediate realities of food, shelter, and safety. When she did notice the signs of his resources, her reaction was muted, shaped by exhaustion and caution rather than ambition. To her, wealth did not erase loneliness or pain. It simply existed alongside them. That perspective forced him to confront the truth he had long avoided, that despite everything he owned, he had been profoundly alone. For her, discovering the extent of his wealth was equally complex. It stirred a mix of disbelief, gratitude, and unease. She understood instinctively how power worked, how easily it could shift the balance between people. Even when he treated her with respect, the knowledge lingered that he had options she could barely imagine. He could leave at any moment, reshape his life with a single decision, while her future felt fragile and uncertain. This awareness sharpened her resolve to maintain her sense of self, to accept help without surrendering agency. She did not want to become another person defined by his resources, another reminder of the dynamic he had fled. Their conversations began to circle around the idea of worth, though neither of them named it directly. He spoke of achievements that felt hollow, of milestones reached without anyone to share them with. She spoke of dignity, of how quickly it could be stripped away by circumstances beyond one's control. In these exchanges, wealth lost its usual authority, becoming just one element in a larger, messier human experience. Emotional isolation emerged as the common ground between them, a quiet ache that transcended class and circumstance. They were both, in different ways, outsiders, pushed to the margins by systems that valued them only for what they represented, rather than who they were. The mansion itself seemed to absorb these realizations, its empty rooms echoing with conversations that had never taken place before. He found himself lingering longer in shared spaces, delaying his retreats into solitude. She noticed the subtle shifts in his behavior, the way his guardedness softened when she spoke honestly about her fears. Neither of them framed these changes as healing or redemption. They simply existed, small adjustments that made the isolation less absolute. For him, acknowledging loneliness felt like weakness at first, a crack in the armor he had relied on for years. But her acceptance of her own vulnerability challenged that belief, suggesting that isolation was not strength, but a response to pain that no longer served him. Wealth, once his shield, began to feel insufficient. It could provide comfort, security, and choice, but it could not substitute for understanding or connection. This realization unsettled him deeply because it dismantled the logic he had built his life around. He had believed that by controlling his environment, by limiting access to himself, he could avoid being hurt. Yet here, in a decaying mansion shared with someone who had nothing to gain from him, he felt more exposed than ever. And paradoxically, more human. The isolation he had embraced was no longer absolute, and the wealth he had hidden no longer felt like the defining feature of his existence, but rather a backdrop to a deeper struggle he was only beginning to confront. Change did not arrive as a single moment of clarity or a dramatic shift in circumstance. It unfolded slowly, almost imperceptibly, shaped by countless small interactions that altered how they saw themselves and each other. For her, transformation began with the realization that survival did not have to mean constant fear. Living in the mansion had taught her resilience, but sharing it with him introduced a new dimension, one where endurance could coexist with moments of rest. The steady rhythm of shared days softened the sharp edges of her anxiety, replacing relentless vigilance with cautious trust. She began to notice that her body responded differently to the world. That tension no longer ruled every breath, that the child she carried seemed to grow stronger in an environment shaped by unexpected care. Her sense of self, long defined by rejection and loss, started to shift. She was no longer only the girl cast out, no longer just a body marked by judgment. Through their conversations, she found space to articulate thoughts she had buried under survival instincts. Speaking aloud about her fears, her hopes, and even her anger allowed her to reclaim parts of herself that had been suppressed by shame. He listened without interruption, without trying to reframe her experiences into something more palatable. That simple act validated her reality, reinforcing the idea that her story mattered, that her pain did not need to be minimized to be accepted. For him, transformation took a different shape. His life had been defined by control, by the careful management of risk and distance. Emotional detachment had once felt like mastery, a way to protect himself from disappointment. Her presence challenged that belief not through confrontation but through consistency. She did not demand vulnerability from him. She modeled it. Watching her navigate uncertainty with honesty and determination forced him to confront the emotional stagnation he had mistaken for stability. He began to question whether the walls he had built were truly keeping him safe or merely keeping him numb. As they grew closer, their interactions became less cautious and more intuitive. Silence between them shifted from awkward to comfortable, filled with shared understanding rather than unspoken tension. They learned each other's rhythms, the moments when conversation flowed easily and the times when quiet was needed. These patterns created a sense of partnership that neither of them had anticipated. It was not defined by grand declarations or promises, but by mutual presence, by the knowledge that someone else was there, witnessing their existence without judgment. The child became a quiet catalyst in this process. For her, the baby represented both vulnerability and purpose, a reminder that her future was no longer hers alone. For him, the presence of new life introduced questions he had long avoided about legacy, responsibility, and meaning. Observing her care for the child even before birth stirred something within him, a recognition that nurturing was not weakness, but a profound expression of strength. It challenged his assumptions about what it meant to protect, to provide, to truly be present. Transformation also emerged through conflict, through moments when their differences surfaced and could not be ignored. She confronted him when his detachment slipped into avoidance, when his instinct to withdraw threatened the fragile balance they had built. He struggled with these confrontations, unused to having his emotional boundaries tested, but he did not retreat as he once would have. Instead, he listened, uncomfortable but engaged, learning that connection required effort as well as openness. These moments did not fracture their bond, they deepened it, proving that growth often demanded discomfort. The mansion itself reflected their transformation. Spaces once untouched were slowly reclaimed, not in an attempt to restore former grandeur, but to create warmth and functionality. These physical changes mirrored the internal shifts they experienced, evidence that decay was not inevitable, that neglect could be reversed through attention and care. Working together on small tasks fostered a sense of shared purpose, reinforcing the idea that rebuilding was possible, both externally and within themselves. Through their connection, she began to imagine a future not defined solely by survival. Possibility, once a distant concept, took on tangible form. She allowed herself to consider what she wanted beyond immediate needs, to envision a life where she and her child could exist without constant fear of rejection. This shift did not erase her past, but it reframed it, transforming trauma into a source of insight rather than limitation. She learned that strength did not require isolation, that accepting support did not diminish her resilience. For him, transformation meant redefining success. Wealth and autonomy, once the pillars of his identity, lost their exclusivity as measures of worth. He discovered fulfillment in presence, in shared moments that could not be quantified or controlled. This realization unsettled him, forcing him to confront the emotional costs of the life he had built. Yet it also offered a sense of liberation, the possibility of engagement without exploitation, of intimacy without transaction. Their connection did not erase inequality or difference. They remained shaped by distinct histories and perspectives, aware of the imbalance that wealth and power introduced. What transformed was not the absence of these realities, but their approach to them. They acknowledged disparity without allowing it to define their relationship, choosing respect and transparency over denial or dominance. This conscious navigation fostered a deeper sense of trust, grounded in mutual recognition rather than illusion. Transformation, in its truest form, manifested in how they saw themselves reflected in each other's eyes. She saw herself not as a burden, but as a person worthy of care and respect. He saw himself not as a distant figure defined by success or failure, but as someone capable of growth and connection. Their bond became a mirror that revealed potential rather than limitation, possibility rather than fear. In this shared space, change was not an end goal, but an ongoing process, unfolding through connection, vulnerability, and the quiet courage to remain present even when certainty was impossible.